And thanks of course to the Discovering Amistad for inviting me to participate in this lunchtime forum. I unfortunately missed Dr. Lawrence's presentation, but Paula graciously made it available to me via video, and I certainly was here for indeed the last presentation. And the whole issue of Sengbe Pierre is one that is a known quantity in Sierra Leone at the moment. It did not always exist in that particular context. It wasn't always very much a known issue until fairly recently, one might say. The very subject of Sengbe Pierre and the rebellion, the Amistad rebellion itself, insofar as it pertains to Sierra Leonean scholarship, was first addressed in 1978 in an article in a short essay by Arthur Abraham entitled Sengbe Pierre, a Forgotten Hero? It's a question there. And we followed that with a short biographical essay, indeed, in the Dictionary of African Biography in 1979, simply entitled Sengbe Pierre. But the dictionary contribution itself was, in a sense, meant to refute the notion that there was an unawareness of the Amistad case among Sierra Leone historians. However, the Amistad saga was not a preeminent part of the production of a national history that was strictly, if you will, anchored on ethnic identities, as a Sierra Leonean historian actually put it. In other words, the discourse—
Sorry, Dr. Cole, I think you need to press play for your slides. They're still in the viewer mode. You need to see the little, down in the bottom corner, there's right corner, there's a little podium thing. A little bit further to the left. Keep going. It looks like, there it is. No, not that one, the other one. The other direction. The one that looks no, two to the left. Sorry, two to the right. Two to the right.
Excuse me, Ben. I wanted to actually keep it that way because I'm going to be skipping, slides. Some of the slides.
I beg your pardon. I'm very sorry.
Yes, I wasn't going to just simply put, the slideshow. So.
Oh, okay, sure. I apologize. I'm sorry. Okay, so you can move you through them manually. I apologize.
That's okay. I've lost that.
I'm sorry, I can hear you. What?
I said I must have lost the original one. I think.
Okay, can you move your mouse?
I am trying to move my mouse, but it's kind of getting static.
Oh.
Just a second. Bingo. We're back.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, as I was saying, of course, even those Sierra Leonean historians, at least some of them were aware, of course, of the Amistad saga, as we put it. The whole history or the teaching of the episode itself in Atlantic history was not a preeminent part of the production of a national history. As I was saying, one that was strictly anchored on ethnic identities. And so in a sense, the Amistad and related Atlantic histories was not privileged in what one has actually been led to believe was this narrow nation building project of post-colonial Sierra Leone. And the Amistad, in many ways, of course, I think I was saying this or talking to Paula earlier on, was not part of the discourse. Certainly it was not part of the curriculum in the post-independence primary as well as secondary school histories. I, as a product of that system, when I was going to school, we were never given the privilege of learning about the African past, African history. In many ways, of course, we were pretty much, if you will, made to learn, we are required to learn the history of the mother country. Certainly, we knew more about European history, we knew more about European civilizations than we did of African civilizations. In fact, there was no such thing as African civilization or an African civilization. It was very much indeed a discourse in which the idea of an African civilization, for that matter, African civilizations in a plural sense, of course, was something that was rejected. It was essentially, if you will, an outgrowth of the teachings of the likes of George Hegel. And later on, the teachings of an Oxford don, by the name of Hugh Trevor Roper. Trevor Roper actually simply posited that there was no such thing as African history. This was only an extension, of course, of British history. So that's what we were actually made to learn. We are actually, pretty much, if you will, enslaved, if I may use that word, in a sense, of course, so an acculturation of things British and things European. So in effect, there was an oversight. Again, too, unfortunately, on the part of the producers of Sierra Leone, of course. I thought somebody was interrupting or intervening. But this oversight, of course, came to be corrected later on by professional historians in Sierra Leone. But I would say the foremost role in this, in restituting or restoring, of course, the importance of African history, and for that matter, of course, the importance of Sembe Pierre and the Amistad episode, was not undertaken or not originated by professional historians in Sierra Leone. It was a function of the theater in Sierra Leone. It was essentially simply the role and place of literary artists who really and truly went on to usher into the collective consciousness the idea, of course, of the importance of Atlantic history. That is not to say, of course, that there are not Sierra Leoneans who are actually engaging in Atlantic history. The Atlantic discourse and the agency, of course, of diaspora and Africans is very much part and parcel of indeed what's going on at Frobe College, the leading institution of higher learning in Sierra Leone today. Playwrights and performance artists retrieved Sembe Pierre and the Amistad Saga from the footnotes of Sierra Leone history and placed it on that national consciousness, thereby reinstilling in a collective sense of the people their country's place in the discourse on the Atlantic trade in human beings and the Black Atlantic discourse. The Freetown players, it was pronounced Freetown, that's what we call Freetown in Sierra Leone in our local Creole language, now called the Freetown Players International, went on to stage a theatrical performance entitled the Amistad Katakata. Katakata, of course, is a Creole word that could be interpreted in several ways. It could mean insurrection, could mean mutiny, it could mean rebellion. But everybody actually talks about the Amistad Katakata today. And it was staged at the British Council Auditorium in 1988. I want to elaborate a little bit, of course, on the whole tradition of dramatic arts in post-colonial Sierra Leone or post-independent Sierra Leone. But actually, I should really foreground that as well too. In the pre-colonial period, part of the discourse on dramatic art originated in the pre-colonial period. It was part and parcel of Sierra Leone society. The various ethnicities had their own variations, of course, of dramatic art performances. They did this in the villages, and of course, those who migrated into the city during the interwar period also staged street performances. And this include, of course, in the drama, these include tragicomedies, these include, of course, dances, and so on and so forth. And that became very much part and parcel of that society. In the colonial period, of course, we had as well to this social acculturation, where indeed dramatic arts was furthered, where it was furthered only in the service of the colonial state. That, of course, geared towards the transformation of the Africans who had been wallowing in darkness, supposedly, by the British. And they included in many ways, of course, Shakespearean plays, tragedies, etc., etc. It was in the post-independence period that local artists sought to, in effect, reclaim that tradition, staging plays that reflected their own growing social and political consciousness. So earlier on, we started seeing plays, of course, by older, shall we say, of course, Sierra Leonean playwrights, the likes of Sarif Ismon, another, if you will, Oxford Don by the name of Eldred Jones, who was indeed the principal, we call it principal in Sierra Leone, as supposed to be president of Frobe College, one of the earliest, if not the earliest institution of Western education in Africa, established in 1827 as a divinity school, later on evolving into a full-fledged university affiliated with Durham University in England. But they were actually writing plays as well too, some of course with African, if you will, traditional inputs, but in many ways as well to continuing this aspect, of course, of British colonialism. Elliot Jones, for example, actually wrote on Macbeth, he wrote on others, and they staged that. But younger generation of artists actually simply departed from that tendency or that tradition. One of the earliest ones that we actually had was Madame Yoko, a female leader who actually simply went on to join a traditionally male-dominated esoteric society, the Toro Society, one incidentally in which, of course, the likes of Sembe Pierre and others actually were members of. And then one of the more interesting and very popular dramatic art performance had to do with the subject of Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba, of course, was a nationalist leader in the Congo, who was the nationalist leader as opposed to the others in the Congo who are very much, if you will, restricted to ethnic nationalism. And Lumumba, of course, was opposed to the Belgian state, and he had the audacity, the temerity to indeed give a speech in the newly minted Congolese parliament in which the King of Belgium was represented, or actually was present. And he actually called out not just the Belgians, the French, and the English, and the Americans, but because of that temerity, that demonstrated audacity, he ultimately actually lost his life. So he became indeed, if you will, a cause célèbre for Africans, including scholars, as well as indeed dramatic arts performers. And indeed, of course, his play became very, very much common, distributed across the country in various performances. And so we know about Patrice Lumumba. That was indeed one of the ways in which, of course, performance artists became agents, or if you will, reflected an agency, an African agency, in informing the public about, of course, certain things that may not have been represented in history, a history in which, of course, the written word was important, but also considering the fact that indeed much of the Sierra Leone population actually suffered from low literacy rate. Those, shall we say, performances in the street, and in some cases in theaters, certainly served to bring, as it were, history and memory to the consciousness of Sierra Leoneans. Oral traditions became, of course, the effective distributor or vector of said, indeed, memory. And so we got to learn about that. And in this case, of course, the Freetown Players International went on to continue that very tradition. And their staging of the Amistad Katakata, of course, simply went on to have some resonance across the Sierra Leone population itself. And it resonated because of the very fact that enslavement actually featured prominently in the country's historical consciousness of itself than perhaps in most, or in many, if not most, of the other West African societies. I will elaborate on that a little bit. Sierra Leone itself, or at least modern Sierra Leone itself, has usually been, if you will, traced to 1787. I say modern Sierra Leone because the area in which modern Sierra Leone is situated has a history of indeed thousands and thousands of years. But in 1787, you had the relocating of the so-called Black royalists. That is to say, African Americans who had participated in the American Revolution, whose agency, whose ideology of freedom was appropriated by, if you permit me to say, of course, the founding fathers of this country, the United States of America. And of course, when they sought to fight, they were not necessarily fighting, as they came to be called, as royalists to the British crown. They were fighting for their own freedom. They were providing their own African-American agency. And in effect, as a result, of course, they fought gallantly, indeed, in pursuing and prosecuting the American War of Independence. The founding fathers did not necessarily pay attention, of course, to these so-called Black royalists. They did not want to enable enslaved people, of course, to fight. They were not going to give ammunition, guns and ammunition, of course, to enslaved people, because they were afraid of, in a manner of speaking, friendly fire. So they did not. It was actually left to the last governor, the last British governor of Virginia, Lord Dartmouth, who actually appealed to those who were indeed in bondage to cross over and fight. And if they did, of course, they will be given manumission, which they actually did. So eventually they were repatriated at the end of the American War of Independence to England. So they became very much the first, if you will, demographic group to be settled in Sierra Leone in what was crowned Granville Town. It became, of course, a haven for so-called freed slaves. And of course, in 1792, those who had not been able to be repatriated to England, who had made their way to the north in Canada, of course, in Nova Scotia, also had the ability to really be transported across the proverbial Middle Passage in a reverse fashion, of course, to be settled in Sierra Leone. And then the third demographic group actually arrived as well too, the Maroons from Jamaica, who had been engaged in a long period, of course, of rebellion across, against the established British plantation owners on that island. In 1807, of course, we had the formal abolition of the slave trade by the British Empire, or in the British Empire. 1834, of course, the abolition of slavery. All of those who actually are subsequently freed by, indeed, the anti-slavery squadron put on sea on the Atlantic by the British, were resettled in Sierra Leone. So this is exactly where we had the makings of what became Creole society. So that sense of enslavement and subsequent and consequent freedom on the part, of course, of those who had been, if you will, dominated for an extended period of time, was very much part of the Sierra Leone consciousness. The Amistad drama, of course, indeed as explored on stage, of course, tells the story of slavery. That's very continuation of the idea of enslavement and the quest for freedom. And more importantly, of course, it talks about how Africans in many ways had always been opposed to slavery, even in their own context, because in many ways, of course, we had domestic slavery, not just the Atlantic trade system, but domestic slavery. So of course, once that play was actually staged, people actually simply felt that it actually had a certain amount of resonance as far as they were concerned. But as well, too, the play served as a regeneration, of course, of Sierra Leone by invoking tradition, in this case, history and memory itself. So largely as a consequence of the successful production of the Amistad Katakata in 1988, Sembe Pierre's profile was raised across the country. Historians have sought to engage the confluence of history and memory, of course, along with its, if you will, correlated discontents. When in 1992, the then government of Sierra Leone, of course, was overthrown by a group of subaltern officers, that military regime that came to power, the National Revolutionary Provisional government, went on to appropriate the image and indeed profile of Sembe Pierre. They wanted to simply create some semblance, of course, of legitimacy by appropriating Sembe Pierre's image. And as a result, of course, they went on to really go on and simply release, just a second, a banknote, a 5,000 leone banknote. And in many ways, of course, that banknote itself served as some kind of call to attention, not just to indeed the gallantry of Sembe Pierre, but as well too, on the part of the NPRC government, of course, in many ways, to call on the young to engage in a regeneration of Sierra Leone's history, to call on the young to participate in national nation building. But they dropped that ball, so to speak, of course, not long after, because Sembe Pierre, of course, in many ways, came to be a very, if you will, short-lived experience in Sierra Leone. We would actually go on to see Sembe Pierre again being appropriated by the government of Sierra Leone after the return of civilian rule, when the government actually went on, in effect, to name a bridge after Sembe Pierre. It's called, of course, Sembe Pierre Wallace Johnson Bridge itself. And it was opened indeed in 2019. But the original bridge was named after Wallace Johnson. Wallace Johnson was a thorn in the side of the British colonial state. He was the, if you will, the major advocate for this working class of all ethnicities. So in 1979, then President Shaka Stevens actually named a bridge connecting Freetown and Juba, and for that matter, the Freetown Peninsula. So when in 2019, of course, the government in power of Joseph Mada Bio went on to rename the bridge Sengbe Pierre Wallace Johnson Bridge. It raised a ruckus in the country, a whole lot of hue and cry that, in fact, what Mada Bio was doing was effectively appropriating the name of Sengbe Pierre to promote his own ethnic nationalism. The idea, of course, was that Sengbe Pierre was a Mende, and indeed, of course, his government was effectively based on the support of the Mende people of the south and southeast of Sierra Leone. Some scholars have said that Sengbe Pierre actually had an alleged Mende, if you will, ethnicity. Why alleged? Well, the idea, of course, was that Sengbe Pierre was not exactly a Mende man, that in fact he was a Shabu. But the Mende people, of course, who happen to be the largest ethnic group in Sierra Leone, also were, not unlike the British, very much a colonial entity. They were very much imperialistic. They dominated other societies, and they went on, indeed, in many ways, to superimpose Mende-ness, if you permit that phraseology, on them. So in this case, the government simply went on, not by simply allowing the Freetown City Council to name or rename, which actually had the mandate to do so, but by simply renaming the bridge by fiat, of course, the Sengbe Pierre Wallace Johnson Bridge. The idea, of course, was that by and large, if anything, Sengbe Pierre's name should have been placed on any number of bridges in the southeast or south of Sierra Leone. But the government wanted it to be located in the western area. The western area of Sierra Leone was not necessarily started by the Creole people, even though they became dominant after indeed the relocation of manumitted groups in the Freetown Peninsula. So it's effectively a Timne country. So if you can see where I'm going here, the politics of ethnicity was very paramount, of course, in the discourse, in the post-independence discourse on Sierra Leone. But cultural and regional, nationalism, of course, simply would go on to use the Amistad revolt leader and the politics of that ethnicity in many ways. And this is where the problem actually lay. The Juba Bridge, of course, was supposed to be indeed representative of this icon of nationalist movement and the working class. And so when you had that renaming, people actually felt that indeed it was inappropriate. Malabia would also go on, in effect, to continue to project this idea of his government as representative of the two interests, of course, of African nationalism, Sierra Leone nationalism, and for that matter, as evidence of his own awareness of the importance, of course, of the Atlantic slave trade, especially as it pertains to Sierra Leone and Sierra Leoneans. So by and large, indeed, he continued to do that. In fact, he would go on to make a subsequent visit in 2019 to Connecticut, where he visited the graves of indeed some of the Amistad captives who had actually died in the New World, so to speak. So that's a foregrounding, a rather long-winded one, as it were, but a foregrounding of the discourse, of course, of the Amistad, Sengbe Pierre and his Amistad compatriots and their return to Sierra Leone, where indeed they would go on, at least in the post-arrival, if you will, of course, would go on to have an impact on present Sierra Leone history. As we note in the article, of course, the victorious Africans in the Amistad case, we are faced with the question of whether to stay in the United States or whether to return, of course, back to their native society. The decision, it turned out, of course, was not as difficult as it may have seemed, because Pierre and his compatriots elected to return home to Sierra Leone. The challenge of repatriation and indeed the idea of going back to Africa, not on the Amistad, but on a new seaworthy vessel, was one that they confronted head on, or at least their sympathizers in the United States confronted head on. Initially, President Van Buren was actually asked if the US government would assist in providing transportation for them. Well, Van Buren's own attitude, of course, was not unknown to those who had been paying attention. He was not interested in providing that transportation. In fact, it was Van Buren who, in fact, had gone on to oppose the dismissal of the case and indeed effectively served to have the case come up before the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So when he turned them down, there was a question, of course, well, how do we then get these Africans to return back to their natal societies? It was left to the Amistad Committee to go on and arrange for several, if you will, speeches to be made by Sembe Pierre and other members of the committee. Sembe Pierre was the foremost leader. Many of these people, of course, had learned to speak English, not in any commanding way, but they had nonetheless learned to speak, of course, a certain amount of the English language. And so they went on to give speeches, sympathetic speeches, across the northeast of the United States. And that served in many ways to raise funds for them. Interestingly, at this particular point in time, there was indeed a history to this. Olaudah Equiano was another former enslaved person, along with Otoba Kubuano, who was, of course, from the area of Ghana. They had also served to conscientize the Europeans, particularly, of course, in the British Isles or in Great Britain, about the evils of the slave trade. They went about, indeed, giving lectures. Indeed, those two men had, in fact, obtained significant education to go on, which allowed them to write, their books, respective books. And so they actually talked to people, and in many ways, of course, they served to raise the level, or rather the consciousness of people, as well as the profile of the anti-slavery movement in the British Isles. When indeed Sembe Pierre and his compatriots went on to give talks, people actually listened and they paid attention, and of course they sympathized with them. So ultimately they were able to raise enough funds, a little over $1,800, to buy a vessel, or purchase a vessel that was named the Gentleman. What's the name? Gentleman, of course, to take these people back, of course, to Sierra Leone. And eventually they actually made their way to Sierra Leone. And of course, according to Arthur Abraham, when they arrived in Sierra Leone in January of 1842, their arrival was met with great enthusiasm, but that initial encouragement was not sustained in the national consciousness until recent times. And nonetheless, of course, when they arrived, they eventually made their way into the interior, where indeed the Mende mission was established. In May of 1841, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church would go on to resolve that the Africans be sent back to Sierra Leone to spread the Christian scriptures. The resolve to engage in Christian evangelicalism was a project, interestingly, of the Black Church, but the mission itself was not necessarily indeed controlled by the Black congregants. In August of 1841, August 18 to 19 of 1841, Sembe Pierre and 4 others in his group were indeed enrolled as members of the United Missionary Society, which was a mostly African-American convention. However, American abolitionists resolved to place the leadership in the hands of Reverend William Raymond and Reverend James Steele, with an African-American lay preacher, Henry Wilson, in a subsidiary role. Sembe Pierre actually wanted Griswold, one of the leading members, of course, to accompany them, but he was not allowed to do so. At least he was not on the vessel that took them to Sierra Leone. So in 1844, a Mende mission or Komende mission was established in Chabo County in southern Sierra Leone. And by mid-1840s, 1846 to be precise, of course, the AME missions had actually proliferated in the Sierra Leone interior. Unfortunately, a good number of those who had actually been returned to Sierra Leone, Sembe Pierre and his group, including Sembe Pierre himself, it must be noted, were not as enthused to really participate in the Christian evangelicalism that was now commenced in the interior. And the question has been raised as to how do we account for the reluctance of these members to become part and parcel, of course, of the Christian mission in Sierra Leone. The idea, of course, was that there was a certain amount of white paternalism and patronizing attitudes that went on to alienate Sembe Pierre and others. But however, we must actually acknowledge the very fact that indeed the AMA would go on to affect the distribution of Christianity in Sierra Leone. It eventually had to give up that leading role in this American Baptist, if you will, evangelicalism. It turned over leadership to the Evangelical United Brethren in Christ. And the EUB went on to facilitate the spread of Christianity in the interior of Sierra Leone, eventually also to extending that mission to Freetown, the capital city. And you still have a very prominent church in the area of Central Freetown, in the area of Goddy Street and in the Regent Road, where the EUB Church has actually attracted a great deal of following. But before the EUB Church itself really and truly commenced the construction of that building, its presence had actually been made very clear and very effectively in the founding of the Albert Academy, which the mission actually will go on to nurse into really becoming very much one of the preeminent academic institutions in Sierra Leone, whereby, of course, many of the nationalist leaders, the anti-colonial resistance, were schooled. In the interior, they actually went on to establish the Harford School for Girls in Moyamba. And that school also, too, was very much, if you will, important, given the fact that it established a school for girls. A high school for girls was not indeed common currency in Sierra Leone, certainly not in the interior. So when that school was established, it gave an importance or a recognition to the importance of schools for girls as opposed to just simply a male bastion, education being a male bastion. So those two schools actually today still represent the very important role by the United Brethren in Christ. And those two schools as well too would go on to produce many of the people who were eventually sent abroad, as they say in Sierra Leone, for further studies, where many of them actually came to the United States of America, obtained their secondary school education, went on to Ghana, indeed, their baccalaureate, as well as indeed the post-bachelor's degrees, and many of them going on to become very prominent members of the post-independence government of Sierra Leone and serving in many capacities in the Sierra Leone bureaucracy. So we can actually talk about that in this particular context, and by and large, of course, Western education became very, very important in that context. Albert Academy and Moyamba would go on to provide some kind of parallel to the dominant role hitherto played, of course, by the Church Missionary Society, the British Church Missionary Society, which had effectively served to more or less retain leadership in the area of Western education. The CMS, Church Missionary Society, not only assisted the colonial government, but it became very much responsible for education at a time when colonial states, not just in Sierra Leone, but across, of course, West Africa and perhaps in other African colonial entities, were not necessarily interested in education. The French government abolished, or rather absolved itself of any responsibility for education. It was left, of course, to the Jesuits and others to provide that. In Sierra Leone, of course, the CMS simply took the mantle and went on to establish two schools, the Sierra Leone Grammar School, of course, and indeed what came to be known as the Freetown Institution, later on renamed for indeed the daughter of one of the ministers of the CMS, the Annie Walsh Memorial School. Those two schools, along with Albert Academy and indeed Moyamba, Harford School for Girls in Moyamba, are today two of the preeminent entities in not just Sierra Leone, but in West Africa. Many people in other African countries, other West African countries, went on to get their schoolings, of course, in either the Sierra Leone Grammar School by the CMS and the Annie Walsh Memorial, again by the CMS, but also to the Albert Academy and Harford School. And indeed, many of those students who had actually graduated from the Albert Academy and Harford School for Girls went on to matriculate at Furabe College. Furabe College having been established in 1827, as I actually alluded to. And by and large, education became the preeminent way in which not just the scriptures, of the Christian faith were actually simply distributed, but also to a way of getting people to be conscientized about their African traditional past, unlike the situation during the colonial days and the immediate post-independence era, wherein, of course, it was effectively a socialization or acculturation in British precepts, were simply the dominant trend. But those two schools now came to embrace their African traditions. And indeed, of course, in many ways, we still have that in Sierra Leone today. So I would actually stop there. And of course, I'm sure we can simply go on to talk about some of the developing issues, of course, in the Q&A at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cole, for that excellent talk. And you really shed some perspective on the complexity and instability of the legacy of Amistad in Sierra Leone right up to the present day. I'd like to begin by asking you one question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. You're welcome to raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, or you could post your question in the chat and I can relay it, or you can ask your question directly. So, but while we're waiting for some questions from the audience, I think that what you've described is so different to in Sierra Leone is so different to what people in the United States understand about the legacy of the Amistad, right? Particularly when you talked about the struggle over the bridge and all these different dimensions that it's really taken its own trajectory in Sierra Leone. And so I'm just wondering, you know, when we were writing our article together, we looked at the sort of the legacies and the types of ways that things are celebrated or affirmed. We talked about the opera that was produced, and we talked about obviously the currency and the bridge. So I don't know if you want to share your thoughts about how can we really explain why there are so many different ways to think about the Amistad today? What would you say for someone who's trying to grapple with the different ideas that are at play in the United States and Sierra Leone, for example? How would you try to bring those into conversation?
Yeah, enlightening, thoughts there. For the most part, the Amistad mutiny, rebellion, insurrection, however we may want to put it, was in many ways indeed an America-centered discourse. And one could also talk about it, and others have, Marcus Rediker and others, of course, Ibrahim Apple and so on, talks about it in the context of American triumphalism. That by and large, it was American laws and indeed the rule of law in America that will go on to contribute, of course, to the manumission or the freedom, if you will, in this case, a court freedom, as opposed to just simply being freed from enslavement. But that was discussed, that, of course, we know more about the role and place of John Quincy Adams in this particular context. And John Quincy Adams, of course, went on to valorize, or at least to validate the importance, of course, of the rule of law in America. And so many more books have been written about Senghor-Pierre and the Amistad case by American scholars and discussed in America. If you notice, I keep saying Senghor-Pierre as opposed to indeed Joseph Sankey or Joseph Cinque, as the case may be. So it was an American exercise. And so many people, of course, know about it. Interestingly, it served the abolitionist movement in America. And of course,
you're muted. Jibril, you seem to have accidentally muted yourself.
No, I didn't do that. It just came on the screen, that you have been muted.
You're back now.
Yes. But I was simply saying, of course, that indeed in America, he's a known quantity. He was a known quantity by excellence in many ways, even though, quite frankly, it was also an academic exercise in America. Many people did not know of Senghor-Pierre, of course, outside of the academy, or those who may have been privileged to watch some of the dramatizations, opera and so on and so forth. But that was better. In the case, of course, of Senghor-Pierre's return back to Sierra Leone, hardly anybody knew about him. In fact, Charlie Hafner, who was the leader of who is the leader of the Freetown Players International, talked about the very fact that prior to 1985, hardly anybody knew about Senghor-Pierre in Sierra Leone. Charlie Hafner actually gave this lecture at Yale University where he brought up that issue. It was only, of course, after Senghor-Pierre and the Amistad group had been rescued from what you might call, of course, historical footnotes or the dustbin of history, that many people actually came to really know who Senghor-Pierre was. And by and large, of course, he became very much part and parcel of the post-colonial state itself. Interestingly, if I may say so, the staging of that play was highly subversive in Sierra Leone, in post-colonial, post-independent Sierra Leone. It was actually staged during the reign of the successor for the authoritarian rule of Shaka Stevens. where Shaka Stevens, once he actually decided to leave power, handed over power to his military force commander, as opposed to his vice president, as the constitution actually required. And so when he actually handed over power, it was with the understanding, of course, that his iron-fisted rule would continue. And so when Charlie Hafner and others actually went on to stage display, it was highly subversive. It was effectively talking about the insurrection on board the Amistad, but of course as well too, simply in many ways, perhaps, not in so many words, but implicitly calling for an insurrection against indeed the one-party government of the APC in Sierra Leone. So while in America, it was very much demonstrative or reflective of that American triumphalism and the importance of the rule of law, in Sierra Leone, where the rule of law itself had actually been subverted, where the rule of law, in fact, had been marginalized, if not completely eliminated, where indeed, of course, the government was ruling by fiat, indeed, the staging of that play itself became a call for an uprising by the subalterns of Sierra Leone. Young people in Sierra Leone actually went on to embrace the image of Sengbe Pie. They were actually singing songs about Sengbe Pie. They were actually drawing murals across the streets of Freetown about Sengbe Pie. Today, of course, they are still making sculptures about Sengbe Pie. So in effect, on both sides of the Atlantic, or at least in the South Atlantic, in Sierra Leone, of course, Sengbe Pie actually became a symbol of indeed the cry for freedom, the cry for the regeneration of post-independent Sierra Leone. So I like to think of it as a very subversive play. One indeed, of course, obviously was not eventually, quite frankly, stuck to by those who are in the political realm.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We have a question from Tammy Denise. Would you like to ask your question, Tammy, directly?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jabril. I wanted to first say, since I first learned about the Amistad captives, I have always been an advocate of using his actual given name, Singbe PA. So thank you so very much for reminding everyone of that. But my question to you is, could you please be a little bit more, I need a little more clarity on the ethnicity. Were you saying that Singbe was not Mende, but he was more Sherbro, or I kind of got a little confused in that area?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm sure there'll be some confusion. I'm not necessarily saying he was not Mende. There was the continued, in fact, in the continual discussion as to his Mende-ness, that indeed, of course, he very well may have been a Shabo. As I was trying to explain by elaboration, indeed, the Mende actually happened to have been a group that was very much imperialistic, that is to say, it's engaged in territorial and indeed social expansionism, and went on to, in effect, bring in other ethnicities that were transformed into Mende. They were given a certain Mende identity. For example, the Loko people. The Loko people actually happen to have been among the original settlers in Sierra Leone, among the original inhabitants in Sierra Leone. But as time went on with Mende expansionism, they went on to appropriate Loko territory and went on to integrate, indeed, the Loko people. If you look at the languages of the Mende and the Loko people, there's a certain similarity that one might, if you listen closely or you don't listen closely, you might not be able to really, until quite frankly, distinguish one from the other. For example, indeed, in the greetings, I'm not a Mende speaker, nor am I a Loko speaker. But you can actually tell when the Mende actually greets, say, Bua, Bise, indeed, the Loko will say Bichere, as opposed to Bise. So they were eventually, of course, included, integrated, or assimilated into Mende society. And so it was as well to several other groups who were not completely assimilated, but indeed, of course, socially and culturally influenced to a significant extent, the Madingo people, the Fula people, and so on and so forth. And certainly the Shabo people. Shabo happens to be a very minute fraction of indeed the populations or the demographic groups of the South. So many believe that indeed Sengbe Pie may very well have been a Shabo who became Mendeized. But Mende also had, of course, a very important, effective vector of acculturation. That is the esoteric group called the Poro Society. The Poro Society is a secret society. It's still in existence today in Sierra Leone. It's still very much part and parcel of the political discourse. And so in effect, through that Poro Society, many people actually became very much identified with the Mende people. So the discourse actually happens to be around the question, of course, of whether Sengbe Pie was actually a Mende or was he a Shabo. So it's not my assertion, it's me simply my alluding to the very fact that indeed his very ethnicity itself is a bone of contention among many Sierra Leonean scholars.
Thank you. We have a question.
Thank you so much.
We have a question from the group, from the chat. Does President Mata Bio acknowledge the sentiments of the various ethnic groups? And is he working to bring them together? Is there an effort to work together? And what are some of the things being done?
It's a very important question. In fact, I think one of the tragedies of post-colonial or post-independence Sierra Leone has to do with the lack of a vision, or a demonstrated lack of a vision on the part, of course, of the leadership in terms of fully integrating the peoples. You see, it doesn't serve their purpose in many ways. It's not unlike, and if you permit me, of course, as a naturalized American citizen, to really allude to present the context of American politics. We need, of course, indeed, integration in this society. There's a demonstrated division in this society, and it serves the purposes of those who may very well serve to integrate American society, to really and truly seek to really, shall we say, eliminate the divide, the political divide in this country, because it serves their political agenda, it serves their political purpose. So it is with Sierra Leone. The post-independence leadership have not demonstrated that capability, that political will to bring people together. On the other hand, it serves their purpose to divide people, not unlike, of course, the colonial or imperial agenda of, divide et impera, divide and conquer, divide and rule. And so they have not been making any effort whatsoever in bringing people together and unifying the country. One would have thought that indeed the so-called civil war, because it was not a civil war, in my estimation, if I may just simply go on that tangent, that it was not a civil war. It was essentially, of course, those who had been empowered by the Shaka Stevens regime to really and truly be used as foot soldiers in the war of domination, decided at a certain point in time that, well, rather than fighting, of course, for the leaders, they might as well fight for themselves and take over the government. Hence, indeed, the beginnings of that so-called civil war. But you might have actually thought that after the tragedy of the Civil War, the carnage that was wrought by the Civil War, or those who were engaged in the Civil War, there will be an effort to unify the country. But this lack of vision, not just in terms of indeed the economic agenda of the post-coloniality, but also in terms of creating that social tranquility needed for development, the present government, and indeed for that matter, of course, previous governments have not demonstrated that awareness.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Robin.
Dr. Cole, thank you again for your insights and taking the time today to share your scholarship with us. A question about the Amistad ship visit to Sierra Leone, and I think it was in 2009, when the organization that ran the ship prior to discovering Amistad, it was called Amistad America, but the ship actually traveled across the Atlantic and visited several ports and went to Senegal and Sierra Leone. I didn't know if you were there then or read any historical accounts of that visit, or whether it had any impact on what you're describing as a sort of the politicalization of the Amistad story in your country.
I was in the United States at the time, attending school in the US, but I was very much aware of the resonance of the arrival of the ship itself in Sierra Leone. In fact, in many ways, it actually led to this consciousness raising, if I'm overusing that phrase itself, of course, forgive me, but people actually became very much aware of the importance of that ship. And it was, of course, the first time that living Sierra Leoneans indeed became aware of what indeed a slave trading schooner looked like, even though it, of course, was a replica. But people were very much enthused about it, and they talked about it, and they made music about it. One of the more popular musical forms in Sierra Leone, of course, is reggae music. And they made reggae songs, of course, about the Amistad. And keep in mind, of course, reggae originated in Jamaica. And Jamaican reggae music, the Rastafarians, in many ways, of course, simply were utilizing their lived experience, of course, as descendants of the enslaved on that island. And of course, how it's actually, if you will, is correlated with the quest for freedom in Africa. And of course, their own eventual return, of course, back to Africa. The late Bob Marley, a reggae icon, was once asked if you were interested in returning back to Africa, or whether he had any plans whatsoever in his life to return back to Africa. And he said, without any equivocation, that absolutely. That's exactly what his plans were. Unfortunately, he died before that. But most of the other reggae singers are very much aware of their Africanness. There's no, if you will, demonstrated, of course, equivocation on their part. There's no wishy-washiness on their part. They identify with Africa. And so, in effect, when the schooner actually arrived, or the replica of the schooner arrived in Sierra Leone, that went on to further that consciousness raising. And so people sang about that. That sounds very promising. That sounds very positive, right? Except that it didn't turn out to be that way. Indeed, eventually, that enthusiasm waned out, or it waned. And so we don't actually have any evidence today, of course, of the long-lasting impact of that particular experience in Sierra Leone. The present government of Mada Bio, as I said earlier on, simply both Mada Bio, the president, and his wife visited, of course, Connecticut and went to the graves, of course, of those who had actually died during the period of the case itself, or perhaps even before that. And so they maintain that. But it's only for, indeed, a short-term self-serving purpose. They are not necessarily very much enamored with history. In fact, in many ways, history actually serves as a subservient, or rather, subversive element in the day-to-day politics of Sierra Leone. The politicization of ethnicity and ethnic regionalism, of course, or ethno-regionalism, certainly, indeed, of course, simply instructs, from their perspective, the idea, of course, of avoiding that, because it may very well go on to undermine the efficacy of their rule or the legitimacy of their government. That's the tragedy of post-colonial and post-independence Sierra Leone.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Cole?
Yes,
can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of the Sierra Leone Refugee All-Stars. They have played in Connecticut, and I just have a couple questions for you. First of all, is there a train in the country of Sierra Leone? Is there a train that runs for people? I'm not talking about a freight train, but a train for people. Does it exist in the country of Sierra Leone?
A transportation system on rails. That's part of one of the fascinating aspects, of course, of the African colonial, or shall we say the European colonial economy in Sierra Leone, the British colonial economy, and for that matter, across the African continent. And at a certain point in time, of course, we may have actually had this understanding or this idea that eventually, indeed, the establishment of a railway system in the respective African colonies will go on to serve as the basis, of course, of the transportation network across the African continent. But all of those railway networks that were actually established by, indeed, the French, the British, the Portuguese, as the case may be, in their respective colonies, were meant to serve the interests of the colonial economy. They were actually simply, indeed, one-way streets, in a manner of speaking, or one-way rails, where, indeed, the railways that were established connected the centers of production, of agricultural production or mineral production, from those centers to the coast, where, indeed, of course, indeed, vessels were available to, in effect, transport and distribute, of course, those agricultural products. In the case of the British, from Pendembu, from Shegbema, I'll call these names that may not necessarily, of course, matter, but they were the centers of production. And of course, the railways, of course, will bring those goods to the Freetown Harbor. Freetown, of course, is coastal, and of course, simply transport them to Europe. Now, let me also quickly point out that that was not a bad thing, in the sense that it may very well have served as the basis for the creating of a transportation network across Sierra Leone, if not even between African countries. But across Sierra Leone, that would have been the case. When Shaka Stevens' government actually came to power after a military interregnum in 1967-68, indeed, Shaka Stevens decided that the railway was, quite frankly, a non-entity. It actually would not serve the long-term economic purpose of Sierra Leone. So it was lobbied, and I emphasize lobbied, by not just members of his own cabinet, who were effectively lobbied by extra-Sierra Leonean interests. In this case, of course, I could bring in America. The American government, by and large, not just in Sierra Leone, but in other places, had effectively been lobbying for road transportation, for the automobile industry. And of course, with the introduction, of course, of rubber, of bicycles, and indeed, of course, the Ford Motor Company and others, it was deemed necessary to have automobiles as opposed to railway. Ironically, America did not discontinue the railway. European countries did not discontinue the railway. Sierra Leone went on, the government of Sierra Leone went on to discontinue the railway. And so in effect, it actually went on to diminish the effectiveness of centers of production. Agricultural productivity, in fact, indeed was undermined when those centers of production effectively were shut down. And in the process, of course, there were no feeder roads connecting those centers of production with the main roads that we are now serving the automobile industry.
And Dr. Cole, I just want to say, I'm sorry to cut you off. This has been fascinating, and we're just about out of time. We're running over. And so for those of you that have additional questions, Dr. Cole will get those questions to you. And we thank you for this. This has been, I just feel like we could go on for another hour dialogue. This has been absolutely fascinating. And Robin, who is the co-chair of our board, has a few last things to say, but thank you so much for this. Thank you so much.
Dr. Cole, I just want to echo Paula's thanks on behalf of the board of directors of Discovering Amistad. This is the end of a 3-part series for those of you who weren't able to tune in on the earlier lectures. But I really want to thank Dr. Cole, Dr. Felipe Gonzalez, and Benjamin for leading us on this journey.
Thank you so much.
It was really terrific.
It's been amazing, amazing.
We hope to do this again. This is part of our plan to become a national and really an international resource. And it's wonderful to have scholars from LSU, University of Texas, University of Arizona to lead us on this discussion. I want to make one brief announcement, which is Anthony Davis, who wrote the opera Amistad, is negotiating with the Lyric Opera of Connecticut to bring that opera back to Connecticut in 2024. And Discovering Amistad could be a producing partner of the opera. And we might invite Dr. Davis to join us on the next seminar series in the fall, because we definitely want to continue this. We're on a roll.
Absolutely.
And a special thanks to Paula and her team for pulling this together. It's been a wonderful journey. And Ben, Lawrence, thank you for your leadership as a board member to make this all happen.
Thank you, everybody.
And the final thing is that we just want to invite you to come to CHIP. Samantha's going to pull up the tour. Yes, so that you see where we're going to be over the next few months. So please come visit us on the CHIP. We look forward to continuing the dialogue with you on the Amistad. So thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Try to come to New London, Dr. Cole. We welcome you as a member of the diasporan community. I'm not finished with you yet. I want to know how we can be helpful today with Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much. I look
Real
forward to
time.
that.
All righty.
Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you all
everyone.
for attending. Have a great afternoon.